The letter said the ranch was hers, and the lawyer who handed it to her said it like he was handing her a problem he didn't want anymore. Josephine Caro had been a schoolteacher in Halifax for 6 years, had grown used to the particular cold of a classroom in February and the particular silence of an apartment in March, and she had never once imagined that a man she hadn't spoken to in 11 years, her father's brother, a man named Augustus Caro, who'd left the family for the prairie before she was old enough to remember his face, would die and leave her 4,000 acres outside a town called Birch Hollow, Alberta, along with a herd of cattle, a foreman she'd never met, and a debt to the bank that the lawyer described, carefully, as manageable, with the right management. She read the letter 3 times on the train west. By the third reading, she understood that the lawyer's phrase had been a kindness. It was not manageable. It was a slow drowning dressed up in legal language, and the only person who seemed to know how deep the water was had a name she'd circled twice on the page. Holt, just Holt. No first name given, as though the man didn't need one, as though the land itself had produced him the way it produced fence posts and weather. She arrived in Birch Hollow on a Tuesday in late September, the air already carrying the particular bite that meant winter wasn't asking permission. The station was a single building with a tin roof, and the man who met her there was not what she'd built in her mind on the long ride from the coast. She'd imagined someone old, weathered into the shape of the job, the kind of man who'd worked for her uncle so long he'd stopped being a person and started being furniture. Instead, the man who took off his hat when she stepped down from the train was perhaps 35, sun-marked but not old, with the kind of stillness that made her immediately aware of how much noise she'd been carrying in her own chest for 4 days. "Miss Caro," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Mr. Holt, just Holt's fine. Everybody calls me that." He picked up her trunk before she could protest, which she noted, and then didn't say anything else for a long moment, which she also noted. Wagons this way, she had expected. She didn't know what she'd expected. Hostility, maybe. Resentment from a man who'd spent a decade keeping another man's ranch alive only to have it handed, by accident of blood, to a stranger from the east who'd never branded a calf or fixed a fence in her life. She got the silence instead, and the silence was worse, because she couldn't tell what was underneath it. They rode out of town as the light went long and orange across land that didn't end the way land ended in Nova Scotia. No ocean to stop it, no headland, just grass and more grass until the grass became hills, and the hills became something blue and far away that she'd later learn were the foothills of the Rockies, though that first evening they were only a rumor on the horizon. "Was it sudden?" she asked. "My Uncle Hart," Holt said. "He was up checking the north fence one morning and he just didn't come back for supper. I found him by the creek." A pause. "He talked about you sometimes. Not often. But sometimes. He never wrote to me." "No," Holt agreed, like this wasn't news to him, like he'd had 11 years to wonder about it too. "I expect he didn't know how to start." She didn't answer that. There wasn't a good answer to it. She watched the land instead, the way the shadows of the fence posts stretched out long and thin like something reaching, and she thought about how strange it was to inherit a stranger's regret along with his cattle. The ranch house, when they reached it, was smaller than she'd pictured, and better kept than she'd expected. A low log house with a porch that wrapped around 2 sides and smoke already rising from the chimney, which surprised her until Holt explained that Mrs. Pemberton, who cooked for the hands, had been keeping the place aired and the stove lit since word came that the niece was on her way. "You didn't have to do that," she said, meaning the fire, meaning the meal she could smell now, something with onions and beef, meaning all of it. "Wasn't going to let you arrive to a cold house," Holt said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world, and something about the plainness of it. No flourish, no performance of kindness, just the fact of it stated and done, made her chest tighten in a way she didn't have time to examine before Mrs. Pemberton was on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, already talking. That first night, she lay in her uncle's old bed, in a room that smelled of wood smoke and leather and something else she couldn't name, and she let herself be afraid for the first time since she'd left Halifax. Not afraid of Holt. He'd shown her to the bunkhouse where the hands slept, shown her the house was hers alone, had in fact seemed almost careful to establish the geography of the place so she'd understand exactly where the lines were and that he had no intention of crossing them. She was afraid of the math instead. 4,000 acres. A debt she didn't understand the shape of yet. A herd she couldn't count, on land she couldn't read, surrounded by men who'd worked for her uncle for years and would have every reason to think a schoolteacher from the coast had no business being handed any of it. She'd come west telling herself this was simply administration. Sign some papers, sell what could be sold, take what money was left, and go home to a life that made sense. She had not expected, lying there in the dark with the strange new quiet of the prairie pressing against the windows, to feel something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite hope, sitting low and persistent in her chest like a coal that hadn't decided yet whether it would go out or catch. The debt turned out to have a name and a deadline. $4,100 owed to the Birch Hollow Bank, due in full by the 1st of May, or the bank would take the north and west sections, the best grazing land, the land the whole operation actually depended on, and Josephine would be left with rock and scrub and a herd with nowhere to feed. She learned this on her third day, sitting across a desk from a banker named Wexford, who looked at her the way men in Halifax had looked at her when she'd tried to negotiate her own teaching contract. Politely, patiently, and with the settled conviction that the conversation was a formality he was enduring until the real decision-maker arrived. There was no real decision-maker coming. She told him so. He smiled in a way that made it clear he didn't believe her, and told her the bank would, of course, be happy to discuss alternative arrangements, the word alternative doing a great deal of quiet work in that sentence, and she understood, with the particular cold clarity of a woman who'd spent her adult life being underestimated, exactly what kind of alternative arrangement a banker, in a small prairie town, might propose to a single woman who'd just inherited land he clearly wanted gone from her hands and into someone else's. She left his office with her spine very straight and her hands shaking slightly at her sides, and she didn't tell Holt what had been implied, only what had been said. The number, the deadline, and Holt's jaw did something controlled and tight when she said the banker's name. Like there was history there he wasn't going to share with her yet. "We can do it," he said. "It'll be close. But your uncle had a good herd, and this was a good year for grass. If we sell smart in the spring, instead of dumping the whole lot in a panic, and if the weather holds, we can clear that debt without losing the north section." "You sound certain." "I'm not certain of much," Holt said. "But I've run this land for 10 years, and I know what it can do when it's not being mismanaged out of fear. Your uncle started panicking near the end, borrowed more than he should have, tried to expand the herd too fast hoping to outrun the debt instead of paying it down slow. That's how it got to 4,100. It didn't have to. And you let him?" Something crossed his face then, brief and unguarded, gone before she could properly read it. "I told him what I thought. He didn't listen the way he should have. Man gets an idea in his head about proving something, even to people who aren't around to see it, and there's not a lot a foreman can do except keep the cattle alive and wait for him to come around." He looked at her directly then, the first time he'd done that since the station. "I'm not going to make that mistake twice. If you want my advice, I'll give it straight, every time, whether you like hearing it or not. That's the only way I know how to do this job." She found, standing in the cold morning light with the barn smell thick around them, and a man she'd known for 3 days looking at her like her answer actually mattered, that she believed him. It was an odd thing to register about herself, how quickly the belief had arrived, how little ceremony it had required, and she filed the oddness away to examine later, the way she'd learned to file away anything that moved too fast in her chest, before she had time to question whether it was sense or simply loneliness wearing a convincing coat. Winter came hard and early that year, the way Holt said it sometimes did, and Josephine learned the ranch the only way there was to learn it, by doing the work herself, badly at first, and then less badly, riding out with the hands in weather that made her eyes water and her fingers go numb inside her gloves. Learning the names of all 340 head of cattle's worth of brand marks and ear notches. Learning which of the men respected competence when they saw it, and which ones needed to see it twice before the respect arrived. She learned, too, in the slower accumulation of small things, who Holt was beyond the foreman who managed her uncle's debt. She learned he read, that there was a shelf of battered books in the bunkhouse that were his, Dickens and Cooper, and a worn copy of Walden that surprised her so much she'd asked him about it outright. And he'd shrugged, and said a man spent a lot of winter nights alone out here, and you could either talk to the cattle or read, and the cattle weren't much for conversation. She learned he'd come from Ontario originally, Had a sister in Kingston he wrote to twice a year, had never married, had been engaged once to a woman who decided, in the end, that a rancher's life wasn't the life she wanted, and he'd said this without bitterness, like a fact about weather rather than a wound. Though Josephine suspected, without being able to say exactly why, that it had cost him more than the flatness of his telling let on. She learned, mostly, that he was careful with her in a way that had nothing to do with weakness. He didn't talk down to her when she asked questions a more experienced rancher wouldn't have needed to ask. He corrected her form when she was roping wrong, but never made the correction feel like an insult. When one of the younger hands, a boy named Pruitt, no relation, he'd assured her, laughing, to anyone she'd have heard of, made a comment in the bunks about the lady owner playing rancher, Holt had said something quiet and short that she didn't hear the whole of, and the comment hadn't been repeated. By December, she'd stopped flinching when the wind came under the door at night. By January, she could read the sky the way the hands read it, could feel a coming storm in the particular stillness that came before it. By February, she realized she had stopped thinking of Birch Hollow as a temporary administrative problem to be solved, and started thinking of it, without quite deciding to, as somewhere she lived. The night that changed the shape of things came in late February, during a storm that arrived faster than any of them had read it coming. They'd been moving a small group of cattle to the south pasture when the wind shifted and the snow came sideways, and within 20 minutes the world had gone white and close and disorienting in a way that made even the hands who'd lived here their whole lives go quiet and careful. She lost sight of the others for what felt like a long time, and was probably 90 seconds. It was Holt who found her, appearing out of the white like something conjured, and he didn't shout at her for falling behind. Didn't waste breath on anything but getting close enough to take her horse's bridle and turn them both toward the only shelter near enough to matter. A line shack 2 miles off that the hands used in calving season, half-stocked, cold, but 4 walls, and a roof between them and a storm that was, by the sound of it, settling in to stay. They got the horses into the lean-to and themselves into the shack, and Holt got a fire going in the small stove with hands that weren't quite steady. She noticed that, the unsteadiness, and understood it. It had cost him something to find her in that white, and not know, for 90 seconds, whether he would. "You scared me," he said. Once the fire had caught and the worst of the cold had started to lift off the small room. He said it plainly, the way he said everything, but there was something underneath the plainness that she hadn't heard in his voice before. "I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Just." He stopped. Looked at the fire instead of at her, which she was coming to understand was what he did when something mattered enough that looking at her directly felt like too much. "I've buried one person I cared about, who worked this land. Wasn't going to do it again without saying something first." The shack was very small, and the storm outside was very loud, and Josephine sat with her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that was mostly to give her hands something to do, and she understood, with a clarity that arrived all at once instead of building slowly, the way she'd expected something like this to build, that she had not come to Birch Hollow looking for this, and had found it anyway, the way you find something you weren't looking for, because you'd stopped letting yourself look. "I wasn't planning on staying," she said. "When I came out here, I want you to know that. I thought I'd sell what could be sold and go back to Halifax, and this would be a chapter. Something that happened to me once. And now? Now I don't know how I'd leave." She looked at him directly, made herself do it, the way he so rarely did with her. "I don't know how I'd leave you." He didn't say anything for a long moment, and the not saying anything felt different from his usual silences, felt like a man choosing his words, with the same care he'd choose footing on bad ice. "I wasn't going to say anything," he said finally. "You're my employer. You own this land. I told myself a man in my position doesn't get to want what I've been wanting since about October, because wanting it puts you in a position where you can't trust a single thing I tell you about the ranch. Can't trust whether I'm advising you straight or steering you toward keeping me around. I've trusted everything you've told me since October," she said. "I'm not going to stop now because you've told me something else." The storm kept on outside, indifferent to the small warm room and what was happening inside it, and later, much later, after they'd talked until the fire burned low, and the things that needed saying had mostly been said, after he'd put his coat around her shoulders without being asked, and she'd let him, after the particular ease of two people who'd spent 5 months learning to trust each other had finally let itself become something else. She thought about the fear she'd carried onto the train in Halifax. The fear of arriving somewhere with no one, of being a woman alone managing a man's debt in a man's country, and she understood that the fear had been pointed in the wrong direction the whole time. She had not needed protecting from Birch Hollow. She had needed only to be met by it honestly, by one person willing to tell her the truth about the land and stand beside her while she learned to read it herself. They cleared the debt in April, 3 weeks ahead of the deadline, selling the herd smart the way Holt had said they would, holding back the breeding stock instead of panic selling everything the way her uncle had nearly done in his last bad year. Wexford at the bank had looked, when she walked in to make the final payment, like a man recalculating several assumptions at once, and she had let the silence after she set the money on his desk do whatever work it needed to do without offering him a single word of explanation. She married Holt, Nathaniel. She learned his name was, finally, the week before the wedding, when she'd asked outright, and he'd looked almost embarrassed to say it, like the name belonged to a version of himself he'd left behind in Ontario, in June. On the porch of the ranch house, with the foothills blue in the distance and Mrs. Pemberton crying without apology, and most of Birch Hollow turning out because, as it happened, half the town had been quietly rooting for the schoolteacher from the coast since the day she'd faced down Wexford, and walked out of his office with her spine straight and not one extra word spoken. She thought, sometimes, in the years that followed, about the woman who'd stepped off the train that September with a letter in her bag and a debt she didn't understand and a fear she'd carried so long she'd mistaken it for sense. She thought about how easy it would have been to do what the letter half expected of her. Sell quickly, take what money there was, go home to a life that asked nothing new of her. She had not done that. She had stayed, and the staying had cost her a hard winter and a debt she'd had to learn to read, and a great deal of fear she'd had to walk through instead of around. And on the other side of all of it she had found not rescue, not a man who'd swept in and solved her problems for her, but a partner who'd handed her the truth every single time and trusted her to do something with it. The land was hers. It had always been hers, on paper, from the day the lawyer in Halifax handed her that letter, but it became hers in the way that mattered, earned, understood, chosen, somewhere in the long middle of that first winter, in the slow accumulation of small mornings spent learning to read sky and snow and cattle and a quiet man's careful kindness. She had feared arriving with no one. She had ended up, instead, with everything. A husband who told her the truth, a town that had watched her earn her place in it, a piece of prairie that had stopped being a stranger's burden and become, in the plainest and most permanent sense she knew, home.